In MotoGP, KTM, Ducati, Aprilia and Honda all have one thing in common. They all run V4 engines in their bikes. Yamaha is now the only team on the grid that runs an Inline 4. And to top it all off, an Inline 4 hasn't won a single MotoGP race since 2022. But what makes the V4 engine so dominant? Well, today we're going to take a look at all of the reasons why. There's a few key reasons why the V4 is so dominant in MotoGP, compared to a more conventional Inline 4. First off, the design of the V4 allows it to be supplied in an overall better package. This also allows a V4 engine to be lighter, so straight away, two massive advantages. V4s are also able to produce a lot more power than an Inline 4 due to their design, which helps them in almost every scenario across a race weekend, including qualifying and the race. Now, there are some areas where the V4 can struggle, and we're going to dive into those a little bit later on in this video. Now, for the other points later in this video to make sense, I need to first explain how a V4 engine works and how an Inline 4 engine works. Let's start with the V4. A V4 engine, as the name suggests, is a 4-cylinder piston engine where the cylinders share a common crankshaft and are arranged in a V configuration. While there's no regulations in MotoGP stating the degree the piston angles have to be set, all of the teams who run V4 engines run their pistons at 90-degree angles to one another. The reason they do this is for perfect primary balance.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Now, it's not easy to achieve perfect balance, but let's think of it like this. Pistons have their own energy or momentum. When they stop, the energy goes to the crankshaft, giving it a slight speed increase. When the pistons start moving again, some of the energy bounces back, and this causes a fluctuation in the crankshaft speed. Imagine it to be like background noise within the engine. It disrupts the smooth communication between the throttle and the engine or the rear tyre. In V4 engines, when one piston stops, the other, which is connected to the crankshaft at the same point, is at maximum speed, which counters the torque effect, and it's a way of balancing out the inertial torque, which is a byproduct of the piston's movement. So now we know all about how a V4 engine is designed and how it works. What about an Inline 4? As the name suggests, an Inline 4 has all of its cylinders mounted in a straight line. And Inline 4s are almost always mounted transversely across the bike. Or in other words, the cylinders go from one side of the bike to the other. A great design trait of an Inline 4 is there is always a cylinder on its power stroke, which helps with a smooth power delivery. Inline 4 engines have a power distribution system in pairs, which is essentially where the inner and outer pistons operate at the same time. When one pair moves up, the other pair moves down, and this creates a balanced firing interval along a straight line. Now, what I've just described here is an Inline 4 with a flat plane crankshaft, a small variation of how a conventional Inline 4 works compared to what Yamaha uses in their MotoGP bike is its cross-plane crankshaft. Unlike a standard Inline 4, Yamaha's cross-plane crankshaft has its throws arranged at 90-degree intervals, resembling the arms of a cross. And what it does is mimic the V4's firing sequence. By having the 4 pistons spread out at 90-degree intervals, you'll always have one at the top, 2 in the middle, which is one rising, one descending, and one at the bottom. And this can help reduce vibrations in the bike, making it smoother and more stable. So we now know how both engines are designed and how they work. But what about the benefits of the V4 in MotoGP? The first real benefit of a V4 in MotoGP is the size of the engine itself. As I mentioned earlier, a V4 has 2 pistons either side of its crankshaft. One set of pistons faces the front of the bike, and one set of pistons faces the rear of the bike. Let's compare that to an Inline 4 where the pistons are lined up one side of the bike to the other. Because the V4 is a smaller package, it gives the engineers more flexibility to adjust the position, which allows for better mass centering and also helps with being able to get the center of gravity lower. This creates a chain reaction with things like the weight as well. Even though V4 engines need additional parts like 2-cylinder heads, 2 manifolds, it's lighter than Yamaha's Inline 4. The power that a V4 can produce is a massive advantage compared to an Inline 4. Especially within MotoGP, and it's mainly about the crankshaft. A V4's crankshaft is shorter than an Inline 4's, which makes it stiffer and stronger. A V4 engine also creates less friction because it only operates on 3 main bearings instead of the minimum 5 that are required by an Inline 4. Couple that with a 90-degree V configuration and the perfect primary balance, it allows engineers to extract more from a V4 engine, pushing more revs and more horsepower. Inline 4s on the other hand have a longer crankshaft, and they need to cope with the additional flex that comes with it. The Inline 4 also has more friction and more vibrations, and it's harder to extract the same level of performance. Don't get me wrong, it still can be done, but it is harder to do. While the performance of a V4 engine is better overall than an Inline 4, you may be surprised to know that an Inline 4 actually can handle better than a V4 in some scenarios. Now that may seem a bit of a stretch to say, but bear with me. It's to do with the moment of inertia. If you spread the mass further away from the pivot point, which in our case is the crankshaft, it increases the moment of inertia. An increase in this gives a more stable platform, as it takes longer to rotate around its longitudinal axis. Because the V4 has a shorter crankshaft, it has a lower moment of inertia, which allows it to rotate around its longitudinal axis faster, reducing the stability. Imagine you're walking along the top of a garden wall. Do you walk with your hands by your sides, or do you have your arms stretched out? This is the principle. Spreading mass further from the pivot point increases moment of inertia, which minimizes your body's rotation around the top of the wall, thereby giving you more stability and better balance. By the same token, figure skaters pull their arms in to reduce their moment of inertia, allowing them to spin faster. This is why the Yamaha is generally easier to ride, and it's able to carry more mid-corner speed. And this can also help us to understand why some riders can struggle if they go from a V4 to an Inline 4 or vice versa. The riding style itself changes a lot. Now, even though the Inline 4 is more stable and can handle better in some corners, it's a victory that's short-lived. To maximize the benefit of the Inline 4's mid-corner pace, you need to be smoother and take generally more open sweeping lines, making sure that you can get off the brakes early and on the throttle early, to carry more speed throughout the entire corner. This is where the time is gained. However, the characteristics of a V4 powered bike promotes a more V-shaped corner style, riding the bike really hard into the entry of the corner, veering off the apex, to get the bike rotated as quickly as possible, and into the exit phase, allowing the rider to get on the throttle more aggressively. Conveniently, this puts the V4 powered bike right in the ideal line of the Inline 4. So for example, if you're on the Yamaha and you're in the middle of the pack, it's really hard to make progress because you have so many V4 powered bikes around you. Occasionally you will see Inline 4 engine bikes putting in stronger performances. Places like Kota, Mandalika and Sepang all have lots of strong sweeping corners, but those performances are few and far between. So this begs the question, why doesn't Yamaha change from their crossplane Inline 4 to a clearly more dominant and more popular V4? Part of it's because the R&D they already have invested in their crossplane Inline 4. They have an insane amount of data from previous seasons that they're able to use. Not only is this for simply developing the bike, but it allows riders to use their data from the previous season at that same track, helping them to find pace faster. If they were to change over to a V4, they would essentially be starting from scratch and have no previous data to go off of. The other side of that is the cost for all of that additional R&D. They would need to carry out so much more R&D than teams already using a V4 to simply be competitive on the grid. Remember, the Yamaha has been built around an Inline 4. Simply dropping in a V4 engine just wouldn't work, and it wouldn't yield any productive results. Yamaha also has their flagship road bike, the R1, fitted with a crossplane Inline 4. A lot of their marketing would simply go to waste if they changed their race bike over to a V4. And it can actually damage their brand overall. The R1 is a fan favourite road bike throughout the motorbike world, and risking that simply isn't worth it. It's a fine line to balance, but to a certain extent, almost all forms of motorsport is simply a marketing exercise. So now you know why V4s are so dominant in MotoGP. Check out these videos here and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.